I'm here today as the author of a book on the Nuremberg war crimes trial entitled Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial. Why did I come to write this book? As a high school kid growing up in upstate New York, in 1946, the local newspaper carried a wire service photo. It was striking. It was unforgettable to me. It was a photograph of Hermann Goering after he had escaped the hangman at Nuremberg by biting into a cyanide capsule. And there was this picture of Goering laid out with his face in a contorted grimace, and that just stayed with me forever. And I always thought as my writing career progressed that I would like to write something about the Nuremberg trial, and I started very widely. And I read some marvelous books that were essentially legalistic tomes. They were heavy-going, they were thorough-going, but to me, there had to have been a great drama unfolding in the city of Nuremberg, because you had on trial for their lives the 21 surviving top Nazis, men who had been architects of a war that had cost millions of lives, who had been involved in the greatest calamity of the century, the Holocaust, taking the lives of 6 million innocent people. And I got none of that in the books that I'd read about Nuremberg, although I learned a lot about the judicial problems that were confronted there. And so at one point, when I'd finished one of my books, I'd prepared a proposal for a book on Nuremberg. And I submitted it to my agent. My agent submitted it to publishers, and nothing happened. The reaction that I got was, well, this is ancient history. It happened almost half a century ago. There was no real interest. Then I got a most unlikely boost from an unlikely accomplice, and his name was Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein seized Kuwait. The first President Bush organized a coalition led by the United States to drive Saddam and his forces from Kuwait, which exposed the nature of his regime, and he was revealed as a brutal despot. And there's a hue and cry that went up that this man is a war criminal. He should be tried as were the Nazis at Nuremberg. All of a sudden, there's great interest in my proposal that no one had cared about before. I got a number of attractive offers and finally signed with the Viking Press to write Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial. Once I had the contract, the next thing to do was to begin my research. And I started at the National Archives in Washington. I went there and I was put under the care of an archivist historian by the name of Bob Wolf. I explained what I was about, and he said, well, let me take you to see the papers that we have here at the National Archives on the Nuremberg war crimes trial. We got in an elevator and we went to the 6th floor, and then we entered what looked like a cavern to me, just arrayed with these steel shelves, were literally hundreds upon hundreds of these file boxes that carried documents, all the size of the Manhattan phone book. And I said, this is what I have to go through to research Nuremberg? He said, this is what you'll have to go through on this floor, and then I'll take you up onto the 7th floor to see the rest of it. What I was fascinated by was that these documents that Bob Wolf was taking me through were referred to as captured German records. And that very phrase evoked for me still smoldering battlefields, shattered German cities reduced to rubble, files of German prisoners of war in their field gray uniforms, unshaven, dejected, being marched into the prisoner of war cages. And I began to feel the atmosphere of the time that I was going to be writing about. One of the most fortunate occurrences in the course of dealing with the National Archives was one of these good news, bad news scenarios. The bad news was that I had just missed a 45th anniversary reunion of Americans who had actually been part of the Nuremberg trial. I got there just after this happened. But what I did get was a directory that had been prepared, which included the names of all of these people who took part in the trial, where I could find them, phone numbers, etc. And what was very inspiring to me was the fact that these people were surprisingly young at the time. The Nuremberg trial was a young person's game. Many of the people who were prosecutors were in their early 30s, some even in their late 20s. There were many people who did the research, who were in charge of preparing the case against the Nazis. Many of these were people in their mid-20s. I talked to prison guards who I traced through this directory, who were kids really, 18, 19 years old at the time. And it was really fascinating to talk to them. I remember one by the name of Bill Glenn, who was a 19-year-old kid who was in Nuremberg, assigned to the prison, and his job, along with his pals, was to spend 2 stultifyingly boring hours on and 2 hours off, staring into the cells where the Nazi defendants were housed. There was a little square porthole, and they would stare in there, and their principal objective was to see that these people didn't kill themselves. It was not an entirely successful effort. Among the people who were on trial at Nuremberg, among the defendants, there were 3 suicides, of which Goering's was the most dramatic. But in any case, he told me that in order to relieve the boredom of this job, he and the other GIs would sometimes engage in conversation with the defendants, and they would get their autographs. And then they would find, when they took the autographs outside of the Nuremberg prison, that there was a market for them among senior officers, leading members of the Nuremberg trial, be they French or British or Russian, whatever. And the market was commanded most by a demand for the autograph of Hermann Goering. Next, after I finished my work at the National Archives, I moved up to the Roosevelt Library. Why? Well, the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park had the papers of a fellow by the name of Jim Rowe. Jim Rowe had served President Roosevelt prior to the war. He was a young, hotshot lawyer on the Roosevelt staff. War comes along, he went into the Navy, but afterwards, being a lawyer, he went to the Nuremberg trials, and he served as an assistant to the chief American judge, Francis Biddle, a former attorney general. And what was fascinating to me among the papers that Rowe had deposited there were his recommendations of what should be the sentence for the convicted Nazis. And what he would do is write up his opinion of whether it should be death or exoneration or a jail term, and pass them along to Judge Biddle to be discussed with the other 4 judges. There were 4 judges. There was an American judge, British judge, French judge, and a Soviet Union judge. And the most interesting case to me was Albert Speer. He makes a recommendation as to how Speer, who's been convicted, should be handled. Speer was an industrial genius. He was in charge of the preparation of the German war machine. In effect, he miraculously, in my judgment, managed to increase German production of planes, tanks, artillery, etc., while Germany was being leveled by American and British air raids, reducing major cities to absolute dust, to powder. And yet he, by creating underground factories, was increasing German production. Well, in any case, he had been convicted essentially because in the course of his success as an armaments minister, he had used slave labor, people who had to work in underground factories who were literally worked to death. 180 on the average of these people died every day working for Albert Speer. Speer was very, very touched. He was very touched by the difficulty of the guards' role, who had to see after these people. They had to stay down in these dank underground caverns, not very healthy. It wasn't a very pleasant atmosphere. So that's where his sympathies lay, not with the people who were dying working for him. And so Jim Rowe recommended to the court that Albert Speer be condemned to death. On the first go-around, the 4 judges looked at Speer's case and they voted 2-2. They had another round, and the American judge, Francis Biddle, switched his vote, and so Speer was spared the death sentence and wound up serving 20 years. But what was most interesting to me is, however heinous his crimes, while Speer was in prison, during these 20 years, he wrote one of the most extraordinary pair of books about the Third Reich, the most insightful versions of what it was really like in the Hitler's court. I'm sure some of you have read his Spandau Diaries or Inside the Third Reich. Just remarkable revelation of the atmosphere inside Hitler's circle. And in a sense, it was almost worth that he escaped the sentence so that history has these books. The next stop in my research was to go to the city of Nuremberg. I had interviewed dozens of people who had served there, and all of them talked to me about the devastation of that city. Nuremberg was the target of 11 air raids by American bombers, British bombers. There was a fierce ground battle for the city, so that it was just a shambles. There was hardly a building left standing. The Army did a survey of Nuremberg shortly after the war and declared that it was 90% destroyed and that it was a dead city. And I had heard so much about this that I had formed in my mind images of what places were supposed to look like on the basis of what they had been at the end of the war. I was so steeped in the research. And so my wife and I arrived in Nuremberg, and much to my surprise, this city, which had just been blasted to ruins, looked pretty good. It had been restored. It was a city with some medieval history behind it, and it had been very picturesque with these gabled roofs and gingerbread moldings on the buildings, photographs I had seen before it was destroyed. Well, now it had been pretty much rehabilitated, but what was surprising was it looked too good. The buildings were too freshly painted. There were thermal window panes in the windows. There were air conditioning units. And it looked to me almost like a theme park version of what Nuremberg was supposed to be. The most important stop for me in Nuremberg was the Palace of Justice, which was a courthouse. Now, why was the trial held at Nuremberg? A common perception is that Nuremberg, in a sense, represented the heart of Nazism. It was in Nuremberg that these giant rallies were held that we've seen in newsreels and in documentaries on the History Channel, the PBS, where you see these tens of thousands of uniformed Nazi faithful arrayed in almost mechanistic order. Well, the Palace of Justice survived. It was largely intact. It had been hit by a few bombs, but it was not chosen because of the symbolic relationship of Nuremberg to the fate of Germany. Rather, it was chosen because it was standing, it had a prison behind it, and there were going to be a lot of high-level people there. Justice Jackson, a member of the Supreme Court, and other high-level officials who would have to be housed. And among the other surviving structures was a 5-star hotel. So that Nuremberg was chosen for very practical reasons. There was a courthouse, there was a jail, and there was a major hotel. While there visiting the Palace of Justice, I was placed under the wing of Judge Kastner. Judge Kastner took us throughout the building, and my heart was pounding as I was about to enter room 6. Room 6 was the courtroom where the Nuremberg defendants were on trial. And again, in my imagination, I'm seeing the leading Nazis arrayed along one side of the building, and along the other wall of this room are the judges, and in front of them are the prosecutors and the defense attorneys. It's all very fresh in my mind. I've just been reading about it intensely. And I'm particularly imagining the day when one of the witnesses was a man named Rudolf Höss, not Hess, he comes later, Rudolf Höss. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz, and he was a witness at Nuremberg, and he gave absolutely chilling testimony. Höss described, almost as though some business major would describe, how he had come up with procedures to achieve more efficiency at Auschwitz, how he had visited another minor camp called Treblinka, where only 200 Jews were being disposed of a day, and through his advances creating the gas chambers and the crematoria, he had upped the production figures, which is the kind of phrase he would use, to 2,000 a day. So this is the kind of person who's burned my imagination as I enter room 6. Well, physically the room was still reminiscent of what it had been during the trial. But it was kind of a come down for me, because in the witness dock is not a monster like hers. It was some pimply-faced German kid with slack jaw, pasted down blonde hair, who was being tried for a minor drug offense. But in any case, I had seen the courtroom at Nuremberg. Afterwards, we went out to lunch with Judge Kastner, who I discovered had been born and raised in the city. And so I was very curious to know, how did you, the German people, react to having your nation's leaders in the dock like common criminals during 1945 and 1946? Oh, he said, we couldn't have cared less. Our concern at that period was to find a piece of bread. Our concern was to find a sliver of soap. And what was happening in that courtroom might as well have been happening on the moon for all we cared. Now, getting back again to these Nazi rallies, we next went out to what's called Zeppelin Field. This is the place you've seen in so many documentaries and newsreels. It's a huge stadium, and at its height, this is where the Nazi rallies were held. 250,000 uniformed people out there. Albert Speer would design a shower of light, and they would have fireworks and streamers and great 60-foot banners hanging, and this is the place from which Adolf Hitler addressed the party faithful. So it had a major role in the psychology of the Nazi party. When we got there, something like 45 years after the fact, the place was essentially deserted. There were 2 or 3 other people besides my wife and me there, and I looked about this empty husk of a stadium, and I looked in the stands behind the place where the demonstrations took place. There were stands where the Nazi bigwigs, party officials, high military officials sat. And now, when we are there, the cement is cracked and crumbling, and there are weeds growing up through the cracks. And I kept thinking, what a perfect symbol this is. Vainglory, Nazi vainglory brought low. I'd often wondered, how did the German people, after their defeat, how did they regard this barbarous regime which had run their country? How did they behave when the war was over? And I had heard reference to a hole in history. What was meant by a hole in history was that in the years immediately following the war, German students were taught nothing about what had happened during the war years, a hole in history. But underneath these bleachers that I've just described, there had been created a museum which was relentless in explaining the nature of the Nazi regime. You went down there and you saw the horrifying photos of the death camps, and it was a very honest lesson in what the regime had been like. And much to my surprise and delight, at this period, the German attitude towards their past had changed, and you had hundreds of school kids trooping through there and being guided through this museum. Very gratifying to see that. I wanted to visit Auschwitz. It was not necessarily required by my project, writing about the trial, because I had thousands of documents, I had dozens of interviews with the participants, but I felt that I had to bear witness to the place where so much of this horror had occurred. There is a Polish city about an hour from Auschwitz where we stayed, the city of Krakow, which is a very handsome city today. In Krakow, there was a castle that dated back to the 10th century, very forbidding, impressive-looking place, full of ghosts for me because it was from this castle in Krakow that a man named Hans Frank had served as Hitler's governor general of conquered Poland. Hans Frank had carried out his duties with such efficiency, dispatching tens of thousands of people to the death camps, that he was known as the Jew butcher of Krakow. Well, I couldn't help but think back to my work at the National Archives. And while going through these hundreds and hundreds of file boxes there, I'd come across a folder marked miscellaneous. And I always leap onto any folder marked miscellaneous. It is almost always rewarding. And in this folder was the testimony there was a testimony of a woman by the name of Lily Gao. Lily Gao was, at the time the Hitler regime was coming into power, a young woman from a very wealthy, prominent family. And she was being pursued by Hans Frank, who I just mentioned. And Hans Frank was from a poor family, no social prestige, and he was forced to leave Lily Gao. The family broke up the romance. And so he vowed that he was going to make something of himself to be worthy of this woman. He then became counsel in a number of cases involving Nazi thugs in the 20s who had beat people up, engaged in brawls and bistros, etc. And so he comes to Hitler's attention and he becomes the legal counsel of the Nazi party. When the Nazis come into power, he rises very quickly, even in his mid-30s, to become the leading judicial figure in Nazi Germany. And then when Poland is conquered, he is rewarded even more highly by being made, in effect, the despot, the dictator of occupied Poland. Now, he then takes up again with Lily Gao. Now he's a prominent figure and feels that she cannot deny him his success. But what struck me was the irony that, in a way, his motives were very human. We're all familiar with that kind of feeling, that you want to show somebody up who spurned you in your early years. But the methods through which he chose to rise were so ghastly that I could not help but feel very satisfied that among those who mounted the gallows at Nuremberg was Hans Frank. We went out to Auschwitz in a bus with people who were all either survivors of the death camps or children of survivors. This bus went out to Auschwitz, and again, it was just as in my imagination. You go through this gate with the wrought iron sign, there's Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free, which is what greeted the Jews upon their arrival there. We were then turned over to a guide who started to take us through the exhibits. It's a very unsettling experience. One of the first exhibits that we passed through was just heaped with glasses, spectacles, literally thousands of glasses, heaped up maybe 8-9 feet high. Another exhibit that we passed by behind a wall of glass was filled with shoes, men's shoes, women's shoes, dancing shoes, children's shoes. And I stared riveted at these, and I noticed that the soles on many of them had been ripped open. And I asked the guide, why is that so? And he said that the Germans who ran Auschwitz were convinced that the Jews had not turned over all of their riches, their wealth, their diamonds, and were concealing them, so they even ripped open the shoes to find anything that had been hidden. I find that when there are so many crimes committed, they're almost numbing. So I try to concentrate on individual things that bring it to life that you can comprehend. And in another exhibit, there was luggage of every type, good-looking luggage, and expensive leathers, beat-up valises, boxes tied with rope, and there were names on all of them. The German guards had told the people that they could reclaim their luggage afterwards, but that they should get their names on it. So they actually stenciled their names on it with Teutonic efficiency. And I stared at just one of those pieces of luggage, and there was the name Eva Pandor. And I just kept thinking, who was Eva Pandor? Was she Hungarian? Was she French? What happened to her? Did she survive? And that individual sense made the cruelty of what happened there very vivid for me. The next stop on our trip, I want to mention one other thing I noticed at Auschwitz that had a very unsettling effect on me. We walked past a steel bin with wheels on the bottom, and it was filled with hair. And I said to the guide, "Is that what I think it is?" He said, "Yes, it's human hair." And I said, "This must have been taken from old people because it's all gray." He said, "No, the gas turned everyone's hair gray." We went from Auschwitz to Berlin. In Berlin was the Berlin Document Center, which included hundreds of thousands of pages generated during the Nazi regime, detailing the histories of the US, of the SS, of the Gestapo. The whole regime was laid out there in these archives. I was particularly interested there in getting my hands on some documents that had been prepared by the people who administered the Nuremberg prison. This was a council composed of representatives from the US, Britain, France, and Soviet Union. And one of the problems they had confronted, and that I wanted to read how it was resolved, was if a Nazi was found guilty and executed, what did they do with his remains? And I found that document in the Berlin Document Center. Their concern was that if you gave these people a normal burial, that the sites of their burial would become altars or shrines to Nazism. Hermann Goering, at the time of the trial, had said, "We may be in the dock today because we lost the war, but in 50 years from now, German homes will have small statues of all of us throughout their living rooms." And so this is precisely what the administrators of the Nuremberg operation did not want to happen. So what they did was they had all of the remains cremated, and then they were dumped into a little stream, which then fed into a little bit larger river called the Isar, and then into the Danube. So in effect, the existence of these people on Earth was physically effaced. And I remember reading that document thinking, this is a far cry from the statue that Goering predicted would exist in every German home in years to come. When I finished my book, it was published, and I was very, very pleased with the reception. The reviews were very heartening, and I felt very satisfied with the story that I had brought before my readers. Then something happened which promised possibly a greater exposure of the story. Turner Network Television and some other producers optioned the book for a television movie. Well, that was very exciting for me, and then I awaited events, and I would hear, for example, after many months, that they were on the way, that Marlon Brando had signed on to play Hermann Goering. Marlon Brando had dropped out. They wouldn't give him enough money. Another year would go by, and I would hear that the distinguished director Sidney Lumet was going to direct. Then I would hear some months afterwards that Sidney Lumet had artistic differences with the producers and he had dropped out. This went on for 7 years. The project was up, the project was down, the project was in, the project was out. And during these hopes that were raised and hopes were dashed, I realized what a movie option meant. A movie option is to a movie production what a peck on the cheek is to an orgy. Anyway, in the 7th year that this option had been pending, finally the producers managed to get Alec Baldwin to agree not only to star as Justice Jackson, but to become executive producer, and the movie was indeed done. It was aired as a mini-series here in the States that some of you may have seen, 2 hours on 2 succeeding nights, 4 hours altogether. It was also aired in Europe, with the result that something like 30 million plus people were exposed to the Nuremberg story through this television movie. That meant a great deal to me, because one of the most disturbing pieces of information I came across when I was researching the book, and this would have been about 91, 92, a Gallup poll which showed that 24% of the American people did not believe that the Holocaust had occurred. And this was a shocker to me, and all I could think of was, as years go on, this figure is going to grow, because the barbarity of what had happened there would become increasingly unbelievable to people. And so the idea that some 30 million people had seen what I thought was a pretty good presentation of my book might act as an antidote to this widespread disbelief. I might mention the movie did very well. It had a number of Emmy nominations, and the fella who played Hermann Goering, named Brian Cox, won an Emmy for the Best Supporting Actor, and he becomes Hermann Goering. Just an extraordinary performance. I'd like to close telling you a little bit about my conclusions as to the effect of the trial. From its inception, controversy swirled about the Nuremberg trials because it was criticized for being indeed victor's vengeance. That is, the Germans were in the dock because they lost the war, and the Allies were prosecuting because they won. I never accepted that. That's like saying this murderer is in the dock because he was caught. Well, the fact that doesn't exonerate him for his crime. So the idea of a victor's vengeance never carried with me. On a more legalistic level, the trial was criticized as being ex post facto law. That is, the crimes were described, the crimes were drafted and explained after they were committed. So this would be a violation of fundamental tenet of law. In ancient times in Rome, there was an expression, no law, no crime. So this was an obstacle that the prosecutors had to overcome in meeting criticism of the Nuremberg trial. Another one was jurisdiction. By what right does an American judge determine the fate of a German national for a crime committed in Poland? This was another obstacle that's had to be overcome and has been discussed ever since. But I would like to give you my final conclusion on the justice of that trial by just reading very quickly a little bit from my book. The trial, in the final analysis, raises the distinction between law and justice. No saint, no statesman lost his life or his freedom at Nuremberg. All the men who went to prison or mounted the gallows were willing, knowing, and energetic accomplices a vast and malignant enterprise. Nuremberg may have been flawed law, but it was satisfying justice. And on that note, I leave you today. Well, I think that the trial was carried out with a supporting rationale, which is you had these horrendous crimes committed, and if you just walked away from them, it would leave the world with a bewildered sense of where is justice. But that if you conducted the trial and you succeeded in making the case about Nazism, that you would have two benefits. It would have kind of a cathartic effect. People seem to think that if justice is not achieved and the guilty walk free, it's a very displeasing outcome. But that if justice is fairly administered, it has a kind of cathartic effect. But the dividend of that was to bring Nazism and its bleakness and its darkness and its blackness to the fore, to the extent that there was no martyrdom after the war. There's no Nazi who among reasonable people has been considered a German hero, and very frankly, the Germans with Nazism pulled out by the root, as it were, embarked on what I think has been a very successful democracy.
I'm interested in the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson. I'm practically in awe of the fact that we're sitting here today at the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York, talking about a man and the career of a man, a justice, who is truly one of the greats of American jurisprudence. And I teach about the United States Supreme Court and about American law, American jurisprudence, and to be part of this scholarly endeavor right now today means a great deal to me. I read, and this is leading to a question here. I read that Robert H. Jackson believed that his participation in the Nuremberg trials had been, quote, the most important, enduring, and constructive work of his life. And that wasn't necessarily a shock to me, but it was quite a revelation to me because, as I say, I am a student of the Supreme Court and a student of Robert H. Jackson. Could you respond to that comment that Jackson made?
Well, first of all, I think it's very satisfying because prior to his role as the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Jackson had had a very admirable career. He rose from small-town origins here, had 1 year at the Albany Law School. That was the extent of his legal education. Goes on to become Solicitor General, Attorney General, and a member of the Supreme Court, which we would think would be enough success for any man in his lifetime. But that he was pulled off of the court at Harry Truman's insistence, went to Nuremberg, and found this the most gratifying experience of his life. Both speaks well for what he had sacrificed by going there and for the importance that he attached to the trial. Now, as I just mentioned a moment ago, the success of the trial was its complete affirmation of the nature of the Holocaust and, in effect, the shaming of the Nazi regime so that it was dead. I think Jackson, if he had lived longer, might have been somewhat disappointed that Nuremberg did not succeed for a long time, and it has not succeeded very well in achieving one of the other objectives, which was to deter future aggression, to deter future war crimes, and any examination of the history of the second half of the 20th century makes clear that that did not succeed. And what trials we have seen have been almost a mockery of justice. And the trial carried out under an international tribune of Milosevic took so long that the trial outlasted him. So I don't, that would have been probably a disappointment to justice. But the other points are important. The complete exposure of the nature of Nazism, and that sowing the seeds of German democracy.
I think as part of this legacy of Robert H. Jackson, we must pay tribute to the eloquence of his writing. And I read that the presentations of policy by Justice Robert Jackson at the Nuremberg war crimes trials will, quote, rank with the great state papers of American history. I had always known that Jackson's opinions, many of Jackson's opinions, were eloquent statements of American law and American constitutional interpretation. But the same now can be said of the documents associated with his advocacy in the Nuremberg trials as well.
To me, Justice Jackson, through the eloquence that you just described, which I think came from conviction, not just mastery of the language, I think he, from the outset, when he addresses the court in his opening address, becomes the conscience of that tribunal, and that sense of Jackson as the conscience of the tribunal endures to the very end, and he ends on a closing statement which is just as eloquent as his opening statement.
One final comment, and then I'll pass to my colleague. Was there? I'm interested. Was there any in his own mind, in his own intellect and work and so on? Was there any conflict between advocacy and judging? Because he had been a judge on the justice on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, in effect, yes. He comes off the bench and he goes before the bar. The thing that concerned him more than, in effect, switching roles, was that he was on record as an opponent of the death penalty. This troubled him. And he brought his concern before President Truman and other figures in the administration as disqualifying, really. I mean, how can, I think you're going to expect death sentences. And he was told, your job is to prosecute, not to execute. So that he overcame that difficulty. Well, for one thing, the Soviets were rather obstreperous from the beginning. The four prospective judges met in London when they were organizing the machinery of the trial, and when Justice Jackson explained his support for the Anglo system of accusatory conflict, and explained the right of the defendants to plead not guilty, the Russian judge, Nikitchenko, was appalled. You can assume that these people can claim their innocence? You're going to allow that? That was a shock to them. Eventually they had to back off because they were outnumbered. But another problem for the Russians was some feeling that they morally did not deserve a position on that bench. And for good reason. You could argue that the Russians had been parties to the Germans in the Russo-Soviet Pact of 1939, which sliced Poland virtually in half, and the Russians took their half. There was strong suspicion that the 11,000 Poles murdered in the Katyn forest, leading intellectuals, officials, etc., died at the hands of the Soviet Union. So who are these people to be judging the Germans? On the other hand, as you've touched on, Don, the Russians played an extraordinary role in the war. The Russians caused the Germans 8 out of 10 casualties, and we took care of the rest. The Russians suffered 8 out of 10 casualties, and we suffered the rest. Something like 5,000 Russian villages had been just exterminated, removed from the face of the earth. One thing that struck me very powerfully is with their total disdain for Russian culture, when the Germans captured the area where Tolstoy's home was, there was a muddy road in front causing a little bit of difficulty for German vehicles to pass. They took the books out of Tolstoy's library and laid them in there. So there was this contemptuous attitude towards the Soviets. And finally, there were at minimally 20 million Russian deaths during that war. So there was no way you were going to keep them off of the court, even though their politics were certainly morally flawed.